Okay, hi again, everybody. You can hear me? Yes? No, you guys can't hear me? Can't actually get a thumbs up from anybody, can I? Okay, welcome everyone to this month's NDRI webinar. My name's Tanya Socrates and I head the Alcohol Policy Research Team at the National Drug Research Institute. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Miller, who's our esteemed guest. And speak up. But before I do that, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where Peter and I are meeting today and others in the room, the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Many of you know who Peter Miller is. He's a very special guy. He is, in fact, Professor of Violence Prevention and Addiction Studies at the School of Psychology at Deakin University. He is an incredibly active and very valued NDRI adjunct as well. He's a formidable, prodigious researcher, a wonderfully collaborative colleague, and a great friend. And we're very fortunate that some years ago now, he decided to turn his limitless energies and capabilities to alcohol research. Peter's title today is Alcohol Harm, Addiction and the Impacts of Trauma in the Northern Territory. We have 60 minutes allotted for today's session and we'll just let Peter go on as long as he likes, possibly 50 minutes, and then after that we'll take questions if there's time. And if you could please save all your questions till the end and then type them into the chat function. I'll keep an eye on them and we'll pick out the best ones and get the toughest ones and get Peter to answer them. Righto, thank you everybody. I'm going to mute myself and off we go, handing over to Peter.
Trying to write it. I think we're going. Okay, thank you, Tanya. Thank you, everyone. It's a great honour to be here and to talk again. First of all, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay respect to their elders emerging past and present. And also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I've got to acknowledge my many collaborators. I think this project is a fantastic example of collaboration across many institutions and many very smart and wonderful people. I'm not going to list them all. You can see the list there, but it's a fantastic team. I'd also like to really acknowledge the important role of our partner investigators from AMSANT, Congress, the Northern Territory Government, the Northern Territory Primary Healthcare Network, and the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education. It's a terrific partnership and we get lots of really important information and very new ways of thinking, I have to say. It's certainly been a big learning process and we're still nowhere near the end of it. For those of you who don't know, and I suspect most of you do, but just to try to give some sort of background, the reason that we're doing this project is because of the very substantial alcohol-related harm that is seen in the Northern Territory. So NT has the highest per capita alcohol consumption in Australia. 30% of drinkers consume alcohols at levels that put them at risk of some harm. We see very high levels of alcohol attributable deaths, around 3.5 times higher than the general population in Australia. And the death rates in non-Aboriginal people are about double the national rate. And of course, we know that when we talk about how that affects First Nations peoples, we see that in 2012-13, and the numbers look very similar today, alcohol-related hospitalisations were around 9 times higher for Aboriginal people than for other Territorians, and that the NT reported over 20 times the rates of alcohol-related family violence than other Australian states. But like many of us, I think it's really important sometimes to read some of the narratives and to think about the people behind the numbers. In these narratives here that were identified first by a colleague and PhD student of ours, Sarah Clifford, that's now been published. These are decisions from judges in the Northern Territory that are describing people who they're just about to sentence and sentencing remarks. And I think when you look at those numbers and think about them, but you read these stories in people who are being sentenced, you can see that there are incredible levels of trauma and histories of adverse experience which underpin and sit behind the stories that we talk about with alcohol, and the impacts are lifelong and hugely intergenerational. And for me, that's become an overwhelming part of the story. And of course, I'm not the only person to talk about this. Recently, the Northern Territory government released the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, which talked about the many complex reasons for these overrepresentations, with factors such in the criminal justice system that really contribute to the very high rates of incarceration of First Nations people, and the underlying factors which bring them into that criminal justice service system itself. And really briefly, just because I'm not sure who's on the call and what sort of audience I'm talking to, I really wanted to say that, you know, we very much bring a biopsychosocial model, or I do, to my thinking. And over the top of that, I see most of these factors as being related in many ways to a trauma or trauma background. So whether that be genetic trauma, in utero trauma, developmental or institutional, psychological, social, situational, and particularly including shame, and love to talk more about shame. I think that's okay. And cultural. So very much the perspective that we're taking to think about these things. When we talk about alcohol and how to start to deal with that, the evidence is really clear in three major areas about when we're trying to deal with alcohol-related harm and to reduce it. The three key areas are around availability, access, and advertising. Forgive me if I'm telling you stuff you already know. I suspect many people on the webinar already know this. We know that there's overwhelming evidence around restrictions on alcohol availability and the benefits they have in terms of public health, reducing violence and crime. We know that if you increase the number of alcohol outlets, we see higher rates of assault, domestic violence, and crime in general. And we know that if you restrict alcohol availability in things such as shorter licensing opening hours, as Tanya has demonstrated many times, we see reductions in things like overall alcohol consumption, homicide, drink driving, assaults. So we know that reducing alcohol availability works. When we talk about sorry, I've got a banner up the top that's hiding a little bit of my slides. Paul, I don't know what to do about that. Okay. So there you go. More availability. We see restrictions on availability in terms of things like minimum legal drinking age has also been associated with decreases in consumption, traffic crashes, and a range of social and health problems. That's all right. It's okay now. The other part of restriction availability is around alcohol and excise. Alcohol tax, sales taxes, we know that from a very large body of work, that when you increase the price of alcohol, you see reductions in associated harms such as traffic crashes, assaults, domestic violence, and a range of other things. But also that these interventions are incredibly cost effective. Shutting pubs earlier doesn't cost anybody anything in terms of implementation. Similarly, raising a tax doesn't really cost anything in terms of implementation. We also know from some evidence from Canada and emerging evidence that changing the price in terms of a minimum price in Canada was seen to be associated with substantial reductions in traffic offences, property crimes and violent crimes. So again, the evidence suggests there, it's one country, one study, or a number of studies now, that really suggests that we're seeing substantial reductions and benefits. I guess the other thing is also we often hear the narrative around education and that we should be talking around education. And I think for many people in the sector, we know that most of the time when we hear the words you should be talking about education, what we're actually talking about is industry public relations and bodies like Drinkwise. We know that the frequency of messaging is tiny versus an absolute sea of advertising. We don't even know what's being advertised. Some awesome work being done out of University of Queensland and Nick Carra showing us the dark marketing that's happening in Facebook and Instagram and things like that. So then throwing up a Drinkwise sign at the grand final, you know, gee, that's really, really helping. We do know that when we do have enforcement measures, we've seen that it can actually impact on drink driving in Victoria. But I think there's a really important element there around the boomerang effect that we've seen in many drug and alcohol education studies, where there's a proportion of people who are never going to use or get into trouble with alcohol or drugs. There's a proportion of people who are already there. And then there's a proportion of people who are a bit rebellious and who are thinking about it. And when you go, don't do that, they tend to do exactly that. The question really becomes, when we go back and talk about populations who have experienced intergenerational systemic traumas on an ongoing basis with very few resources, what sort of interventions of these types of interventions that we're talking about, the literature tells us, will work? What sort of availability restrictions, what sort of education will work, particularly when you're facing things like intergenerational fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. We're talking about small populations, very large areas, limited resources, and again, systemic deprivation and racism. So, and I think it's really important these are the measures that are in place, but I do really want to note that it's important that we have governments that are brave enough to do trials and brave enough to do evaluations, because in these contexts, looking at the existing evidence helps, suggests areas, but you can't say this is specifically evidence-based, and I think that's really important in these contexts. So within the Northern Territory, and many of you again will know this already, they have a mandatory banned drinkers register, so that in every bottle shop, I'll go into it in more detail next slide actually. They have point of sale interventions. They also have police auxiliary liquor inspectors. I'll explain this all in a sec, but I wanted to give you a timeline there to show that across time since 2011 and much further back, there is a substantial range of restrictions in place, but also we've recently had some really important environmental variants, such as the COVID lockdowns in the Northern Territory, called biosecurity, and then job seeker payments and JobKeeper payments. We'll see how that all plays out. So again, the banned drinkers register prohibits the consumption, possession, and purchase of alcohol for people who have been identified by the registrar and put onto the register. So this applies to all people who purchase takeaway alcohol in the Northern Territory, and they must provide, everybody must provide ID to purchase that alcohol. It goes through a scanner. There's a few ways on which you can get onto the banned drinkers register. The four key ways are being in protective custody more than 3 times, 2 low-range drink driving offences, being the defendant of an alcohol-related domestic violence order, and also having alcohol prohibition conditions put on you by a court. So that puts you onto the register. One other key intervention is around minimum unit price, which was put in place in 1st of October 2018 and set at $1.30. Now, these laws were all actually recommended by the Alcohol Policy and Legislation Review, lead authored by Justice Trevor Riley, and it is definitely a worthwhile read in terms of thinking about frameworks and conducting reviews into how you deal with alcohol and alcohol-related harm across a wide range of elements and communities. So even though it was recommended at $1.50, the Northern Territory government had a look at the different factors involved, and they decided they really wanted to target particularly cheap high alcohol cask and bottled wine and fortified wine. So you can see down the bottom there that in their press releases, they really identified this was the major target. We'll come back to how that worked. And then another really important part of this is what was called TBLs, or temporary beat locations, which were introduced around 2011, then replaced by POSIs, or I can't remember what the acronym means now, and then PALIs. So in 1st of October 2018, police adjunct licensing inspectors. All of these are effectively police officers in bottle shops south of Darwin. What changed was some of the background mechanisms and particularly the resourcing. So key of that is that the big change to PALIs is from being operational normal police officers who are just tasked to be there, but who could be taken away for things like riots or fights or incidents that are nearby, or if there just wasn't enough staff. The licensing inspectors have limited, dedicated powers only to be on the venues, and they are specifically tasked there. So they can't walk away. They have no powers beyond a licensed venue, which is quite important. And these are stationed, as I mentioned, in pretty much every liquor outlet south of Darwin. When you arrive, they will ask you if you're purchasing alcohol, where you come from, and then where you intend to use that alcohol. And you can purchase the alcohol, but then they can then tip it straight out. So obviously they try to avoid that interaction. So for us, within the grants that we put forward and were successful in achieving, we really want to try to understand with these three really substantial measures, how do they impact on people? How do they impact on people's families and their local communities? How do they actually affect an individual's interaction with health and justice systems, including outcomes that are more identifiable, like emergency departments? How do they impact on the community in general in terms of the general trends? So police recorded assaults, hospital admissions, that's the stuff we're used to seeing mostly. And then also, how do they impact on the alcohol and drug treatment sectors? Presumably, if they were having a major impact. And if you think about it a little bit, you've got all these drivers now for people to go and seek treatment. How does that actually impact? Are they seeking treatment? Those sorts of questions. So the research design, like all research designs, of course, it's not going to address everything perfectly, but it's a substantial one. To address these questions, we're doing in-depth qualitative interviews with people who are on the BDR, who were on the BDR, or their families and social networks. We're doing a major data linkage exercise, so following people who are on the banned drinkers register and tracking them through justice, health, treatment and policing databases, and so that we can find out what's happening there. That data collection is still underway. We've conducted semi-structured interviews with people who are engaged in the field, everybody from licensees through Aboriginal health organisations to liquor licensing and many, many other people. And then we're also compiling detailed time series data, so more standard sort of epidemiological analyses to look at everything from emergency department presentations through AOD treatment, child protection, and police recorded assaults, just to name a few. And the list is really exhaustive. The findings I'm presenting today are not from the final project, but they are from the 1 year minimum unit price evaluation with a couple of additions, just because we are still very much in the data collection phase and we haven't been through the appropriate stakeholder consultation in terms of when we get that final data and analysing it. So it's okay because it still actually gives us plenty to talk about. So just really quickly, as I mentioned, within this, we have a huge range of data. I'm not going to go through all of these, but as you can see, we've got Department of Education, Tourism, Health, Child Protection, Police. So when we look at the prices, one of the key things is Michael Livingston and the team, who I think is on the call, isn't he, looked at price monitoring in the Northern Territory. They went and they looked at what was being sold and how price changed. And you can see in this graph quite clearly really the only thing that was impacted at that stage was very much cask wine. The more recent evaluation has suggested some bottled wine was also impacted, but at that stage, when it was first implemented, it only affected the price of cask wine. So very much what the government was trying to do. When we look at how that affected consumption over time, what we saw was across the Northern Territory, a reduction in cask wine, a reduction in bottled wine, and what looked like the beginning of a reduction in terms of fortified wine. There was a really interesting change in terms of mid-strength beer as well, but we don't see how that's related. We did some more evaluation. Oh, those little circles always go off, don't they? One day I'll learn how to do that and then I'll retire happy. So we got what we saw, particularly in Darwin, Palmerston and across the Northern Territory, was around a 50% reduction in the sales of cask wine. But what you can also see across the board is while we saw reductions in terms of wine sales, they were far more reduced, but in terms of total liquor sales, the reductions were substantially less. So we did see reductions, however, they were in the order of 7% across the territory and in the Darwin-Palmerston region. So we did see reductions, but by far the most substantial reductions were around cask wine and bottled wine. But on to probably some of the more telling findings. When we look at alcohol-related assaults across the Northern Territory, you can see here the orange line is around when the Banned Drinkers Register was implemented. Now, when the Banned Drinkers Register was implemented, of course, it started off with about 1,000 people who were already on court orders. That number then increased for the next 6 to 8 months. It got to about 3,500. So it peaked a bit later, and you can see that there's some spikes after. That's also the end of year spike. I think if you look at most graphs, you see a big spike in assault. So don't take that spike too much out of context. But then we started to see what looked like an impact for a while after that. Certainly in relation to those, when we look at ambulance attendances, again, we see a really fluctuating story. There's probably no real clear story there in terms of that, but we do see some sort of apparent reduction, and they were significant, closer to the introduction of the minimum unit price. I think it's really important to remember also that at the same time as the minimum unit price was introduced, we had the pallies being introduced, which changed from a part-time police officer on the bottle shops to a full-time. That change is really important because there was certainly lots of anecdote and story about when the police officer wasn't there, the alcohol industry was quite happy to sell the alcohol to the people who they weren't supposed to be selling the alcohol to. So full coverage really meant that those people were being restricted from accessing alcohol. And there is some theory around that the drinking patterns during that time when the police officers were there for most of the day, then left and then came back, when they had immediate access, people would access a lot of alcohol and they would drink in a very harmful fashion. So that's a theory, but we don't have anywhere near fine-grained enough data to talk about that. When you see the graph on emergency department presentations, again, you can see what looks like a general upward trend before the end of 2017, and then what appears to be a downward trend. However, obviously, this is still in the cycle of 1 to 1.5 years, so it's hard to tell how that continues to play out until we show a little bit data later. And again, when we look at this is Darwin-Palmerston. So here, what we can say confidently in Darwin-Palmerston is there was no pallies. There was no influence of the police officers in bottle shops. While the Banned Drinkers Register was there, it had been in place for quite a while. So when we try to consider the impact of a minimum unit price, you can still see that there is a somewhat downward trend, which has been borne out in subsequent publications as well. Now, when we look at Alice Springs, that's a really interesting case study, particularly because Alice Springs already had effectively a minimum unit price at a lower price of $1.10. They also had the pallies put in place at the same time. So what you're seeing here is, while there was an increase in price, cask wine was already not very available at all, and fortified wine was not available at all in Alice Springs already. So this is the impact of the pallies and the minimum unit price together, implemented on the same day. Really didn't make our job terribly easy. But what we can see here is really a substantial downward trend across a wide range of outcomes. I think it's one of the sorts of graphs we're hoping to see in terms of alcohol-related harm. But it's not just our data. So it's not just us saying this. Interestingly, not too long ago, Jake O'Brien, Wayne Hall, who will be known to many of you, and team published wastewater data, which also showed that the introduction of the minimum unit price was associated with immediate reduction in alcohol content in the wastewater, but they also showed a subsequent upward trend. And I think that's worth keeping in mind for later discussions. This data goes on for a longer period, so this also includes the lockdowns or biosecurity lockdowns. And just to differentiate, the biosecurity lockdowns in the Northern Territory, many people were moved or encouraged to move and supported to move back from towns like Darwin and Alice Springs to their home communities during this period in the attempt to prevent the spread of COVID, and that there were roadblocks put up so that there was very strong measures to try to protect that. So substantially heavier sort of policing than many other states saw, maybe not Victoria, but we can also see the period that job seeker then stayed in place after that too, which is we think an important part of the story. But as you can see, while there were certainly some initial reductions in both towns after the introduction of the minimum unit price, then we saw the fluctuations come back and things appeared to start to rise again. So what we can say from that data is that there are multiple interventions. They can make evaluating things really challenging. It'd be great if policymakers could give us at least sort of 6 months or a year between each one, but then the reality is, and I had a couple of these conversations this week, we say you've got to act on all levels to try to make impact. And the political reality is they've got a very limited amount of time to put in place legislation to get it bedded down and to get things moving before they're at another election. So the methods have allowed us to make some comparisons, but in other places we're really looking at overall impacts. As I mentioned, then came COVID. I talked about the biosecurity zones, but also the impact that while people were locked down on community, they were also receiving still job seeker and job keeper allowances, which was a substantial increase in terms of their income. And when people were let out, we saw that they had substantially more resources, and they were possibly looking to compensate. Now, we're just completing a report for the World Health Organization looking at assaults across the country. So this is police recorded assaults. It's not alcohol related assaults, all assaults. And you can see the Northern Territory is unfortunately the pink line up the top, but you can see a substantial drop when the biosecurity zones were first in place, but certainly still very much higher than the rest of Australia. We're talking about rates that still are way higher than any other state. And then we saw a really horrific and substantial increase post the biosecurity lockdowns finishing. So that's domestic assaults, that's internal in the house. And then when we look at non-domestic, unsurprisingly, we see a dip. So this is effectively your street assaults. The question of how many are related to licensed venues being shut and not is quite an interesting question. In some cities, it gives you an interesting idea of what happens when all the venues are shut and how much violence still occurs on the streets, or is termed non-domestic. So it's still substantial. It's not just licensed premises, I think. But you can see again that reduction immediately. But in the context of this talk, what we can also see is that, post 2018, we saw things starting to go down, but then things had started to come up again before COVID came into place. So that's an important consideration, is that we did start to see some sort of compensation and change. And we have just had released, and I'm not going to go into this in the great detail because we haven't had a lot, but what we've seen effectively is a report released a few weeks ago from Frontier Economics via the NT government who funded it. And what we can really see is that story was a continuing trend. So they have the 3-year trends, and we can see that after the initial decreases, things started to increase up, and they very much match the assault data that I presented before. So without going into too much detail, because obviously we didn't collect the data, but it looks like those trends are pretty much the same. So to wrap up to a degree, we saw that the banned drinkers register, even though the numbers only reached around 3,500, and some people thought that those numbers should be much, much higher. In the end, it was pretty much only police who were putting people onto the register, whereas it was meant to be health and treatment people. There seemed to be some apparent reductions, particularly in the first 24 months, but then we still really don't have the evidence on how this impacted people individually, and we're still gathering evidence in Darwin, around how that impacted the people who are actually on the BDR and their families and community, which is critical evidence, which is why I don't want to make any broad statements. We saw with the minimum unit price, it was very effective in terms of reducing cask wine sales. We saw some reduced assaults in Darwin and Palmerston, which the 3-year evaluation seems to suggest has carried on. But there's more interesting issues when we talk about this in terms of long-term health impacts. It's really important that we think about a minimum unit price, not in terms of police recorded assaults or emergency departments, but about what's the major harm related to alcohol, which is chronic health. And emergency department attendances in 5-10 years' time. That's going to be the space where we expect to see most of the impact of a minimum unit price. What we can absolutely categorically say is it didn't affect tourism, and it didn't affect nightlife venues. And I think we need to be really aware of the catastrophizing that the alcohol industry is engaging in. And then we have the police adjunct licensing inspectors, which is, to anybody's mind, a very extreme intervention. Certainly when you go up and see a police officer in a bottle shop, it's quite an experience. There's significant resources, massive resources, to put that in place in any sort of substantial way. And there's also the potential for some displacement effects to see people moving away from where those police officers are to centres that they're not. There's also other consequences which we need to further understand, but certainly potential consequences include racist implementation, that people are being racially targeted. There's a big issue around re-traumatisation or avoidance of traumatisation by just having a police officer in a bottle shop. And then there's also substantial potential implications around grog running, which I think we need to talk about quite a lot to understand what's happened in the overall context. As I mentioned, COVID and JobSeeker have had further harms. We're now seeing a change of the Stronger Futures in terms of legislation removing dry communities in the Northern Territory. Only people now have to, or communities have to apply to become dry, unless they were already existing under Northern Territory legislation. So that's been another change that we're going to have to try to factor in as we go. And right now we're conducting analyses looking at Queensland data to sort of get some sort of control data and to understand how these things might have impacted differently in different states. As I mentioned, the data linkage finding is going to be really important. But I think it's really important, particularly going back to those the assault slides, to see any real change in when we've seen so much trauma and such an explosion of violence post-COVID in the Northern Territory. We need to have some really clear understandings about people don't just change. You're not going to give them a couple of sessions of cognitive behavioural therapy and fix that sort of trauma overnight. So I think thinking about that is really important. This is one of my favourite slides. It's pretty much my motto, and I think that when we're trying to understand what sort of responses need to be put in place, what sort of thinking we need to do, I would always, these days, certainly strongly encourage people to think of understanding people's behaviour and their use of alcohol and their engagement in violent behaviours in looking at it through the sorts of lenses that will help us to avoid re-traumatising people, avoid shaming people going forward. I've been very heavily influenced by the work of Luna de la Salle in terms of thinking about shame-sensitive practice and shame-sensitive legislation and responses. If we really are serious about reducing people's drinking, we've got to stop giving them reasons to drink. We've got to stop shaming them. We've got to stop traumatising them. And I think some of the ways that we can think about this is the Aboriginal Justice Agreement holds some really important lessons. Certainly I found that document, I don't claim to be widely read in the space, but I found it compelling in terms of my thinking about the ways in which we need to start thinking about responses. There's absolutely insufficient emphasis, and I'm not criticising any government, because you sit there and go, this is where we need to look towards, not look backwards. Certainly, I was really interested in the idea floated there around establishing and supporting local law and justice groups, where we think about local responses, obviously supported within legal frameworks and the right amount of resources, but thinking about local responses for local issues. When you look at somewhere like the Northern Territory and compare cities like Alice Springs or communities like Hermannsburg to places like Groote Eylandt, the dynamics, the issues are so very different that they really do require very different responses. And I think giving communities some real say, some real power around what happens and the resourcing to actually implement that and the control over it is really the next logical step for me. But then I'm not in the place of having to make that happen. So I realise it's a very academic conclusion. To wrap up, there are more questions than answers, as always. Policies really need to respond at different levels of prevention. So while it makes it harder to evaluate, we've got to respond right across from everything like minimum unit price, which is a policy level, at a population level, through to things like the banned drinkers register that really intervenes with people who are indicated to have further response. And I think we always need to talk about having support responses with those. If we're putting people on the banned drinkers register, we actually need to think about the reason people are using it, but also what are we doing to ensure that we know that they're going to seek alcohol, we know that they're going to seek drugs. So for those people who can't change their behaviour, we can't just leave them hanging out there. Otherwise, I think they're probably likely to create havoc yet again. So we've actually got to look at other harm reduction sort of ones, similar to things like wet shelters, prescribed heroin, safe injecting facilities. I think that's a really important one. Again, interventions really need to be trauma-informed, neuro-informed and shame-sensitive. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that while alcohol is in the community, it is causing unbelievable damage, and we need to be thinking about the ways in which we can still reduce alcohol in the community, because until we can do that, we can't address some of these other issues. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm going to unmute myself.